Welcome. This is Stephen Lee, and this is Life and the Living of It. I have the supreme joy to have my first guest. Let me tell you a little bit about Jennifer Ohman-Rodriguez. She graduated Luther Seminary with a master's in divinity. Not only that, while she was going through seminary, she was writing a book, actually two books while you were going through seminary. But not only that, Jennifer published all kinds of faith formulation curriculum based on her experience of early childhood development, which she got a master's in. She's been published by the Augsburg Fortress, Bark House, John Knox Press. She has magazine articles in the Christian Century, Young Children in the Creative Arts, and I could go on and on. And she has just published her book, A Time to Mourn, A Time to Dance, a love story of grief, trauma, healing, and faith, published by the Chalice Press. You are now a published author. When people first meet you, what do you want them to know about you?
Oh, Stephen, of course, right off the bat, it's a big question.
Oh, I know.
Thank you, though. Thank you for having me, and thank you for asking these big and deep questions. What I want people to know about me is that I'm resilient, and I'm only resilient because I understand in order to heal, I have to do the work. And doing the work means showing up to work with healers, such as clinical therapists and body experts, and also doing my own exploration into healing. And I learned so much of that from my late husband, Tony Rodriguez, who was a traumatologist. He was a licensed clinical social worker specializing in trauma, specifically men who suffered childhood sexual violence or people who were suffering from sexual addictions. So that's one of the big things I want people to know about me. Another thing I want people to know about me is I believe I am a beloved child of God, and I also believe they are beloved. How they coin that would depend on how they think about spirituality. So for other Christians, a beloved child of God. For seekers, maybe a beloved child of the universe. But we are all beloved by something greater than ourselves.
To play devil's advocate just a bit, I'm sure you get questions kind of like, how can I be or feel like I'm beloved when all this terrible trauma is happening to me, when I'm in pain, when I'm suffering, when I even have trouble breathing sometimes?
That's a great way to unpack this. What trauma does, a traumatic experience or ongoing traumatic experiences, the evil of it is that we become disconnected. We become disconnected from ourselves, from our environment, and from other people, and from some sense of spirituality. That's the evil of it. It makes us isolate. It makes us go into ourselves. So yeah, I would respond to that yes, it is. It is hard to understand we are all beloved if you're feeling disconnected. Those feelings of disconnection are cues. It's the universe or God saying, hey, let's get you some healing.
You talk about top down and bottom up, and your education was top down, a master's in childhood development and early childhood. But then the practice, it's bottom up. The experience of early childhood development is bottom up. I imagine you experience in your body and in your mind when you were helping people with early childhood traumas. And as you process your own traumas in the last 5 years with the death of your husband.
So in early childhood or early care and education, we are taught as educators, and that's what my background is. It's in education, it's not in clinical work. We are taught to observe the child and then determine what they need. We're not taught to say, oh, here's a 3-year-old, they should be doing ... We're taught to observe them. And young children are They are so in their bodies. So from birth to 3, especially, the frontal lobe just isn't fully online. The thinking brain, the organizing brain isn't online. The emotional brain is really active. And we still see that in older children in the early childhood age groups, the 0 through 8 years of age. So there's always that thinking bottom up or even middle up and not top down, because a child isn't going to get very top down until they're older. So that background for me really sets me up well to understand what the trauma researchers are saying. That and my particular program, I went to the Erickson Institute in Chicago, Illinois, and I worked in many situations where there was a lot of ongoing trauma. So even though this was in the middle to late 90s, when we just had the MRI coming out, we were just getting that kind of scan research, and we were just opening up the possibility that young children could have a traumatic experience that would lead to a diagnosis such as pediatric PTSD. We were just there. So I felt like I was on the front lines of that. I was actually seeing it in especially my Head Start classroom, children doing traumatic reenactments in the housekeeping corner. I mean, that was a daily experience. So a lot of that background really has formed how I think, even how I think theologically.
How did it change the way you think theologically? And how does the observations of early childhood trauma, how did that shape how you experienced your own trauma?
Well, first of all, in my own trauma from the death of my husband, which is a one-time incident, it didn't take me very long to understand what was happening to me in terms of my symptoms. And I was just surrounded by therapists who were experts in trauma. So I could call them and say, my arms hurt. I feel like I've had too much coffee, but I feel like that all the time, and they were able to tell me what was happening for me. I could say my body hurts everywhere, and they could tell me what that was. Not only that, and what to do about it, and sort of how long it might take to fully heal. In terms of my early childhood experience in the 1990s, I think the biggest realization I had as a white woman was that we lived in a country that was sorely divided. I had grown up in one country called the United States of America, but my families they were living in a very different country called the United States of America. And one of my biggest frustrations at that time was to leave work every day and maybe meet friends for a drink or for coffee or for some social event. And I would start talking about these things, and my white friends would turn off. They would just sort of like, oh, no, you're wrong. A lot of gaslighting. And that's just something I've always carried that with me. And it's an interesting time we live in, because I feel like I can finally unpack that and talk about it with other white people. And that's a whole different arena of trauma than I write about mostly in the book, although that does come up because Tony, my late husband, was originally from the Philippines. So he's Asian Pacific Islander, as are my children. So that was very present for us prior to, during, and after he died. It's just a small sliver of that story.
In the first couple of chapters, I got the sense that there was a lot of gaslighting that was done because people didn't want to understand someone in grief. I'm going to give you some platitude, or I'm going to go on with my day.
Oh, right. I definitely felt like people would drop off a casserole and that would be it.
And you had to throw out a lot of those casseroles.
I had to throw out a lot of things, just partially because we have a lot of dietary allergies and intolerances, but also, people would stand in my kitchen and say things like, I know exactly what you're feeling. And I'd say, did your husband die suddenly? Well, no, he was sick for a long time. How old was he when he died? Oh, he was 82, and I'd think, well, what does that have to do with someone dying at 53 with 2 kids still at home.
And you wrote about sudden death grief and how it's different than a grief that is anticipatory, that you can prepare for. What damage does it do when the way to get clarity and closure isn't apparent?
Well, I still am jealous of people who get to say goodbye to their loved ones. I also have that experience. I was able to say goodbye to my father when he was dying because we knew it. But I think the closure we have when someone goes suddenly and unexpectedly, that closure for me happened in my therapist's office. Basically, I had to make up saying goodbye. I had to talk to Tony in Merritt's office and make it all up and tell him the things I wanted to tell him. And I do that in the writing of the book too. I
Yeah.
tell him what I wish I would have said and if I'd had the chance to say. And it's healing and it's necessary and it's not the same. So let's not even pretend. What it ends up being for me is good enough. So I think when I think about pastoral care, spiritual care, we have to just acknowledge that it's not the same. If we're doing the care, it's not the same. And we want the people we are interacting with and working with to get to a place where it's good enough.
In EMDR, there's a lot of somatic in the body work that's done. What was attractive to me about EMDR is that I couldn't throw up resistances because I have my degree in psychology. I couldn't say, oh, this is this and that's this. And it was new. And so I didn't throw up the resistances. What kind of resistances did you throw up during therapies, both somatic movement therapies and also EMDR?
Well, I didn't. That's the thing for me. First of all, because I knew about all this. Tony would talk about this stuff at the dinner table. So as a family, we were well versed in so many different modalities, and he had trained in EMDR as well. And I didn't throw up any resistance. In fact, I was at the other extreme. I so wanted to feel good again because I felt wretched. I was suffering. I wanted to feel good again. I wanted to get rid of all these bodily pains. I was in a lot of physical pain. And I also knew as a parent, my job, if I was going to get my kids through this, because they're 14 and 19, and my 19-year-old had just been diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease. So if I was going to get my sons through this, I had to heal. I had no choice. So healing for me was this incredible act of love, both for self and for my children. And it was also an act of love of lifting up what Tony had done for other people.
What I found profound when I was reading about your movement therapy is that you allowed yourself to collapse with someone else around you, to physically not be able to hold a stance and to collapse knowing someone else is there to literally catch you, to hold you. And I thought, wow, what a profound place of vulnerability and hope that represents. And I started
That's right.
asking myself, would I be able to be that vulnerable and that hopeful in the same circumstance?
If you'd had Meg, you might be, because I didn't do that initially. Like I didn't even trust her initially. In fact, she was reminding me the other day after she read the book, how I would say to her in the beginning, "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" So by the time I let her catch me, she had been building trust with me for weeks. And even those first few times, she would stand behind me and say, "I will catch you. I will catch you." And she's about 5'2". She's petite. Meg was a professional dancer. And so she just has that type of movement about her, and so she's very strong, but I still didn't trust that this petite woman was going to catch me. And so that didn't happen initially, but it did happen with a certain amount of healing, just like a little bit that I needed to get to that point. And once I was at that point, I just was like, okay, you do what you need to do.
Do you find that when the tensions, when the tremors, when the waves of cold or the waves of grief started cycling down, did you find your thinking mind being able to re-engage in things like preparing for the future and raising your children and making schedules and finishing your book, all the things that we all take it for granted that we can do on an everyday basis?
That slowly came back, and it was very slow. Although when I first started feeling like I could think ahead, plan ahead, and remember things, I remember thinking, "Oh, okay, I'm almost healed." But really, I think just been in the last 6 months that so this is 5 years post accident that I really feel like I'm back where I was with my thinking brain. So it's a long process, even if you have really good healers. It still can be a long process. And I can't say how the pandemic trauma has impacted that, although I suspect it has. Suspect it slowed down the last parts of this healing.
Talking about your experiences of God within grief and trauma, how do you experience God when you can barely experience the next second or the next heartbeat? When you know yourself to be disassociated from so much, how is God showing up?
For me, God was always showing up with other people in the actions of other people. And I allowed that. I also allowed myself to not feel God or to not feel faith and not to practice Christian disciplines, especially that first couple of years. I just allowed that. It took me forever to go back to worshiping on Sundays or Saturday nights. And when I did, my attendance was sporadic. But when I was in worship, I remember saying to myself, I can't sing. I can't sing. If I sing, I'm just going to sob. So I'm going to let the assembly sing for me. And I'm going to allow the assembly to pray for me. I'm just going to stand here or sit here, and I'm going to allow them to worship for me. And I came to see that as one of the profound jobs or the profound work of assembled believers is to hold hope and hold faith for those who cannot.
How do you continue to love when your capacity for emotional expression has been truncated by grief?
Slowly and carefully. In terms of parenting, it's doing the best that we can under the circumstances we're living with. And that's something Tony used to say. We all do the best we can under the circumstances we are living in. And I just remembered that a lot, that I was doing the best I could. And it often wasn't good enough. And I knew that. But I also valued the fact that I tried to get up every morning and I tried to love and parent well, and hoped beyond hope that my children understood that I was trying.
And there are moments of grace in your book with other people being profoundly kind
Mm,
around you.
yes, yes. Fascinating to me how people show up in the aftermath of crisis, who and how they show up and who doesn't. But yes, I have a dear friend who I write about in the book who was the one who could just get me to laugh at a time where I wasn't even smiling. But she could get me to laugh about this horrendous situation and find humor in these odd moments that were all just unexpected because we didn't expect to be where we were. And she, to this day, is someone I just hold so dear because of that ability, that gift she gave me, not only of allowing that space for my humor and laughter, but laughing with me.
And you have moments in the book where you go from a very logical narrative, from you're reading a story, and then suddenly you're somatically speaking.
Mm.
Your body takes on the narration. And me as a reader start feeling with the body instead of thinking with the mind.
Yeah, so I think the body in this book is a character. So the reader wants to just hear this logical, cerebral narration, but that's not the aftermath of trauma. This book started with journal entries, and my journal entries, and they were raw and fragmented and full of bodily sensations. And I just continued to write that way because to me it was writing the truth. And to abstract the story out of my body and just into my mind felt not just untruthful, it felt violent. So, yes. Also, I would say about this, and we know this about grief in particular, is we oscillate, especially in grief. We can have kind of a normal conversation, and 5 minutes later, we're sobbing. And then a half hour later, we're on the phone taking care of business. And then we just sort of collapse and can't move. I mean, there's just this oscillation between not only emotions, but what we're able to actually physically do. So I think that comes out in the book as well, that I'm oscillating all the time.
What does recovery feel like from the body to the mind?
Well, for me, it feels like the two are connected again. And for me, actually, it feels like they're more connected than they were prior to Tony's death. And I think that comes out of the recovery healing work. Definitely feel more connected with my entire body, which I say in the article I recently did for Gather magazine, that we are all body. We do tend to separate the mind, the head, from the rest of us, but we are all body. And so I think it's more of a feeling of being all body. And I think for recovery for me also means that I have a thinking way of knowing, but I also have a sensorial way of knowing. I have an emotional way of knowing, and I have a behavioral way of knowing. So how I know things about myself has expanded. My language of how I know about myself has expanded. So I feel more fluent and more multilingual in a sense,
Multimodal.
multimodal.
Have you found that you pick up on other people's grief easier?
I have always been very sensitive to other people for my entire life. I think what happens to me now is when I pick up on a behavior or an emotion that doesn't make me feel good in someone else, that I am more compassionate about it. I sense it now more as pain. Whereas I think before I used to sense it as frustration, irritation, anger. I do sense it more at its root of some sort of unhealed pain. And I am more apt to speak to that pain if I'm responding to someone than to the behavior. At the same time, I am better about my own boundaries. So somebody's unhealed pain doesn't get to hurt me. Like I'm not going to take on their pain. I'm going to push it back to them and say, hey, in my behavior, this is your pain. I'm sorry you have this pain, but it is your pain and not mine.
And some of that came out in the book, especially during the funeral. The priest was having his own hissy fit, I think, because of the communion thing. And you're like, that's not my problem. I don't have space for you. I forgot the exact words you said, but you go have your hissy fit. That's not my problem. And he did, yeah.
He did. He had quite a hissy fit, actually. But that's his stuff, as Tony would say, not mine, especially then, that day, but at any time.
Your book was wonderful. I sat and I read it in 3 hours, and 13 minutes later, I was at the end of it. I think it was so engrossing and engaging because it engaged at all the levels, body, if we're making distinctions, body, mind, spirit, emotion. I found myself having conversations with God, praying for the person that I was reading in the pages. And I felt it in my body when you described the cold limbs and the inner shakiness and the being wrapped up in blankets because you didn't want to leave your bed. I felt those things. And so for me, it was an authentic accompaniment with someone who has been through grief and trauma. What would you like people reading your book to get from it?
I want people to understand that healing is a right, a human right that we have. As a Christian, I'm going to say as a God-given right. So I want them to I want readers to understand that they and their loved ones can heal. Bottom line, you can heal. I think I say at the end of the book, I fully understand that certain healing modalities aren't available to everyone. Maybe they're not in their area, there's not a practitioner in their area, or their health insurance doesn't pay for it, or they don't have health insurance. And so I acknowledge that. And I know that there's just a lot of, especially in the last few years, there are a lot of practitioners who are saying, okay, this is true. You might not be able to access a professional healer, but here's still some things you can do. And I'm thinking of Tama Bryant Davis, Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, and I'm thinking of the clinician Resma Menakan. You know, they're just really good about saying, here are some things you can do. Also, the clinician Deb Dana is doing phenomenal work with some explorations we can do at home that don't cost, they're not the same price tag as professional healing. But I do want people to know that healing is for them. Healing is for everyone. And a lot of times when I listen to traumatologists talk, they will say things such as, when you do some healing, the world shifts and the world does some healing. So at some point in our healing processes, I think we all begin to understand that what we're doing shifts our communities, it shifts our families, it shifts the greater world. And then to me, that becomes loving God and loving others. So answering the Christian greatest commandment. So those are the basic things I want people to know.
And I love at the end where it gives sayings of Tony's
Mhm.
sayings. And I almost started rereading your book with a list of those sayings right next to me because they come up so often. It's like, yeah, Tony would have said so and so, or I hear in my mind, are you safe enough?
Yeah. Yeah, and you notice it even in this discussion we're having, how many times I've brought a saying of his
Yeah.
into the room. And that's a daily occurrence for me and in our family. We quote him. It's a way, well, it's very helpful, first of all. They're very helpful sayings. But for us, it's a way of acknowledging he still lives with us.
Yeah.
He's still so ever present, and he's still parenting my sons, and he is still loving me through these sayings.
I do want explanation of one of them, which kind of struck my attention. Get in the pit.
Get in the pit.
What does that mean?
Well, I think that goes back to when people gaslight or they just say really inappropriate things to people who are in deep pain and deep suffering and despair. Is if you go to the story of Job in the Old Testament, and he's sitting there with his three friends.
Friends. Yeah, quote.
Right. And they're, Job is in the ashes, right? He's torn his sackcloth, and he's, covered in ashes, and his friends are sitting there. And eventually they start talking. And the moment they start talking, they leave the pit. They've been
They're-
sitting with him in silence. They have been allowing him his space to do what he needs to do in his trauma and his grief. And the moment they start talking and telling him like how he brought this on for himself and what he should be doing, they leave the pit. So
yeah.
getting in the pit is another way of saying, let's be compassionate. Because you can't truly sit with someone who is suffering unless you're right there with them. That's in the pit. Everything else is something else. It might be pity, it might be sympathy, it might be judgment, it might even be empathy, which is a good thing. But if empathy doesn't lead us to compassion, to some sort of action, and being silent with someone who's suffering is an action.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what that means. And that comes up a lot in therapeutic talk.
And in the prayers that you shared within the book, and I'm sure in the prayers and devotions with your second book, which will come out at some point, hopefully sooner than later. But your prayers are speaking to a God who's in the pit with you. They're
Yes,
not some being in the sky. They're in the same dirt and filth and blood and tears that you are.
which is amazing to me still because I had no sense of God when I was writing those. I had no sense of God's nearness. I had no sense of God's essence. I just had no sense of God. So I am writing to who and what I want God to be for me.
Do you have trouble rereading your book?
Oh, yes. And part of the publishing process is, as authors, we reread our books a lot before they come out. Like this past fall, it was almost weekly that I was reading that book in its entirety. And yes, it's very difficult. I sob every time. By the end, I'm sobbing. But I'm not reliving. I think this is what people might misunderstand. I'm not reliving the story when I reread it, but I am definitely feeling the emotions
So is that a
of
way of distinguishing between grief and trauma? Trauma, you're being traumatized, but grief, you are feeling the feelings of loss. It doesn't mean you're reliving the trauma.
well, I definitely when I reread the book, I do grieve. So thank you for making that distinction. The other day, when I was talking in another interview about the difference between grief and trauma, I said, and I think this is very true for me, trauma was just this very trauma's aftermath felt like a diagnosis to me. Like I could feel the adrenaline and cortisol stuck in my body. It was everywhere. When I lay down to go to sleep at night, I couldn't sleep because wow, there was a racetrack happening in my body. That felt nothing like grief. That felt nothing like standing in the middle of my kitchen at 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, waiting for the garage door to go up, and it didn't, and just sobbing because the garage door did not go up. So grief was this, or for me, it's just this sense of loss and sense of missing someone and sense of not having that beloved near me. The trauma recovery is just they're just so different. And for me and for lots of people, they happen simultaneously. And I think that's what happens with the people around us is they don't know what to address. They don't know if to address the grief or to address the trauma or which is what.
I imagine going through it, you had problems. Is this trauma? Is this grief? What is this?
Well, yeah, even gosh, even being the widow of a trauma therapist, it took me a while to acknowledge that I had some post-traumatic trauma issues. It took me a while to name that. So in the beginning, no, I was just completely numb and not feeling anything. And so that sort of shock numbness that takes a couple of months almost to dissipate. And it's at that point when I could start to differentiate between the two, but it was a really long process, Stephen. Really long.
One of the best things on the last few pages of your book, I remember you saying grieving is loving.
Yes, it is. We don't grieve something or someone we don't love.
In my own grief, and I think in a lot of people's grieving, I hope eventually they come to that conclusion that here was someone whose richness and presence. I think you said it once, you didn't understand why Tony died, but you did understand why he lived.
Yes, I that's exactly what I say. Because I always understood his work. His work was a calling, and I always understood that. I didn't always like it,
Yeah.
but I always understood it. But we grieve. I think we grieve who and what we loved, but I also think we can grieve what we would have loved to have had.
Yeah.
So I think I also often hear that with people who didn't have the parents they needed growing up. And I think there can be a grief there of not having what they needed. And for me, I think sometimes I grieve. Well, I think there's a section in the book where I talk about grieving not seeing Tony as a grandfather.
Yeah. Not seeing him when your children go down the aisle.
Right. All of
Yeah.
that. All of that. And that'll just keep happening. I mean, that'll be just part of it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how happy we all are, fulfilled, or feeling joy and gratitude. Those moments are still going to be there.
I've heard it said the best legacy someone can leave is a legacy of love.
Mhm.
And I think I understand why the book is an extended love letter. It's a story of love expressed through grief.
I didn't initially know that that's what I was doing. It really took I have a literary agent, and she was the one who first called it a love story. And that got me really thinking about what I was doing. Part of which was, in going back to that feeling disconnected in trauma's aftermath, feeling I felt so disconnected from Tony. And the writing of the book really helped me reconnect with him and with our love. And so now it makes beautiful sense to me that people see this as a love story.
It
But
really does.
initially, I just didn't get it. I was like, no, I'm just writing how crappy this is. So, I mean, toward the end of the book, I talk about what I'm doing, which is, I feel, is a testament to this time, right? A testament to the truth of the aftermath of trauma and the truth of grief. But it's also a testament to love.
It is. And it's that real, authentic, painful sometimes, excruciating other times, but ever present reality that, oh my God, I'm someone who's loved and I'm
Mhm.
someone who does love.
Yeah. And I'm always struck by how, as humans, we often miss the fact that we are loved by another. I don't know about other people, but I do not wake up in the morning and think, I'm loved. It's not the first thing I think about.
Well, it's the first thing I'm trying to think about every morning.
Well, I think I'm going to start trying it.
I can think, oh my gosh, my back went out, but I am loved. I am loved.
Well, I wonder how just even embracing that every day, what that does for us. How does that shift our world and our relationships?
And you're writing the words of life, but they are
Yeah.
words of life.
Well, my prayer is that I'm digging into the essence, the universal essence. I can't even say the word, Stephen. The universal essences of humanity. Yes, it's my lens. And every day I learn more and more about how narrow my lens can be or is. But I'm hoping that I'm digging deep into this question of being human
You
along
really
with,
are.
oh, well, thank you. That's
Let me just validate that. Yes, you really are. I
that's
love the deep end, and you're right in the deep end.
I know that about you, having been in class with you in seminary, that
Yeah,
we are contemporaries there, both not afraid to go there, whatever there is.
yeah.
But to me, that's more important than the
The
others.
unexamined life is not worth living.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I can get a little over examining.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
I've got to pull back sometimes, and there are people in my life that tell me it's a good thing to have fun.
yeah. In college, one of my friends said, "Steve, not every moment is pregnant with significance." And my response was, and I wasn't even trying to be funny, was, "Gosh, that seemed like that was a moment that was pregnant with significance."
Right, right. I would
Like,
say probably every moment is pregnant with significance. I just think sometimes that the significance might be enjoyment,
yeah, very true.
and that's great.
The holy giggling during grief is just, it's a gift. It's grace. It's being able to laugh.
Well, to find that part of our voice
Yeah.
again when it has felt lost is a gift. Definitely a great and grace. But yeah.
In conclusion, there is no conclusion, I understand. This is an ongoing process. Did you have a word of wisdom to leave us with?
I would just repeat that healing is for us to have. That is a grace, the grace of healing. From a Christian perspective, I think God wants us to heal. So what I would leave everyone with is that healing is for me, it's for you, it is for everyone. And that in turn shifts this world. And I'm going to say, I suspect it shifts us all closer to God.
Well, thank you so very much, Jennifer. It was a
Well,
joy.
thank you, Stephen. It was a joy and it was enjoyable and I had fun.
I did too. And this is life and the living of it.